Recording.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We are starting now our first webinar of the course using video to communicate policy research. Just asking you to switch off your mics when you are not using it. I will explain more about this now, but let me welcome you to the Think Tank School. I'm happy to see some colleagues that have already participated in other courses last year or also this year. As you can imagine, I am Leandro Edge. I'm the coordinator of the Think Tank School, and I just want to introduce the webinar today and introduce our facilitator. Before that, let me explain you a little bit about the methodology of the webinars. The first things you need to know is that I'm sorry. Please keep your mics off. Okay, thank you. So what you need to know is that Michael will start soon with his presentation. You will have the possibility to intervene along the presentation through the chat, and also you will have the chance to open your mics and make questions or share your impressions on what Michael is sharing. Of course, Michael will pose his own questions at certain points along his presentation. So basically, you can use both the chat and also intervene by opening your mics at certain points. As I said, in the meantime, please switch them off. If I see that some mic is open and without any specific reason, you will see that I will switch it off on your behalf. So you also should know that the webinar is being recorded, so we will share it afterwards in the platform together with the presentation. I would invite any of you that have not introduced itself yet in the platform to do it, so all the colleagues are aware of and we get to know each other better in the group. And having said that, let me introduce our facilitator. He has already introduced himself in the platform, but let me tell you that Michael is a documentary filmmaker, and he's also the founder of Mediatan Productions, which is a production company that specializes in public policy content. Michael's documentaries have won several awards. So he's a very experienced documentary filmmaker. He has also been supporting on think tanks with our own series of videos. So this course on videos is a new one this year, so we are very happy to have him on board, and we are sure that will be very helpful, and we hope you have the chance to learn a lot from Michael's experience. So that's all from my side. I will now switch off my camera and let Michael start.
Okay, thank you very much, Leandro, and thank you all for joining us. I'm excited for this two-part webinar, and I hope you guys will learn a lot about effective strategies around video. You can see, and you saw in the background note, that today we're going to be focusing on producing effective video content, and in 2 weeks from now, on June 7th, we'll do the second half around strategies for distributing content. And I see these two sides, production and distribution, as two equally important facets of creating, of getting good video content seen and achieving your goals. So that's why I thought it was important to break this down into each one. Let's just jump right into it. Like Leandro said, please, if you have, I want to make sure that this is useful to you all, so please feel free to throw out questions on the chat. If you feel more comfortable just unmuting yourself and asking it, that's fine too, but feel free to ask your questions. I'll pose some questions for discussion for the group as well, but don't be shy to intervene. So in terms of the agenda for today, I want to quickly give you a little bit of background, a little bit about myself, but more focusing on why, the case for why video is so important for think tanks to be thinking about, looking at some research that I've done that led to the formation of my company that I really tried to bring into all the work that I do, and that's certainly been used in building out a lot of the content for this course. And then today, like I said, we'll look at the production process, which is really 3 steps. Pre-production, which is all about strategy, the planning and coordination. And that I've sort of broken down into 6 questions that we'll talk about, that you really shouldn't move beyond pre-production until you've answered those 6 questions. And then the production itself, which consists of production when you're out in the field gathering your materials, whether those are audio materials, video materials, and then post-production, which is the editing portion when it's all brought together. So that will be our focus for today, and then we'll leave with a couple next steps before we meet back here in 2 weeks. So let's start with a little bit of background. Why do I think you should be using video anyhow? Before we spend the better part of 2 weeks talking about using video effectively, I think it's important that we're all on the same page as to why this is important for you to be thinking about. For me, video and film have really been a part of my life as long as I can remember. I fell in love with movies when I was about 7 years old and saw a classic American film called Home Alone with Macaulay Culkin. For those who haven't seen it, it's a real classic, classic Christmas movie. And I watched the movie every single day and would memorize long portions of it and do these long monologues for my family and my parents' friends. So I was hooked on movies from the time I was a kid. And then when I was in college, I discovered the art of documentary, and documentary being this really beautiful way of engaging the outside world and serving as a window into other worlds. And as I was in college, I was also learning about the policy world, becoming more politically aware. And I saw documentary as this really nice way of fusing those 2 interests of mine, being able to shed light on policy issues using film and specifically documentary. And what really started that for me was I was a junior in high school and learned about the genocide in Darfur, which had been going on at that point for about 3 years. And I'm the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, and I was struck by the fact that this had been going on for 3 years and I knew nothing of it. So that's when I really decided to use film to tell stories that aren't otherwise told often and shed light on it. After making 2 films, my first film was The Last Survivor, which followed the live survivors of 4 different genocides, building off the horror that was going on in Darfur. And then I made a second film called Web, which focuses on the global digital divide. And after making those 2 films, I felt like I wanted to learn more about the policy side of things. So I went and I did a master's degree in public policy. And it was there that I realized that the policy world is there's 2 spaces to it, right? I think when we think about public policy, we tend to think of this macro world, which is really a world of systems and number, right? Think big data and looking at lots of data to understand the totality of a problem. But the problem with that is people are not moved. They're not inspired by systems and numbers. They're inspired by stories about individuals, right? So The Last Survivor, my film about for genocide survivors, I think is a good example of this. When we were learning about the genocide in Rwanda, which killed 800,000 people in about 100 days. And that's up here, right? That's the big numbers world, which I think is important for scale, but it's really hard to be inspired by that sort of enormity. It's really hard to wrap your head around that and be moved to action. So what we did was we chose, we looked up here and we found an individual story. We told the story of Jacqueline, who was a survivor of Rwanda, and what happened to her family and how she rebuilt herself after as a genocide prevention activist. And then we used Jacqueline's story to serve as an example for why this issue is so important and to engage people in action. So I think that's something a lot of people have been focusing on for a while, is trying to move from this big world of systems and numbers and translate it down to a world of stories about individuals. And that's where I see video as being really important. But it's not just about inspiring people. I think I've more and more understood that stories can be a really important part of influencing decisions and decision making. So this is a quote that I love. This is Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, even though he's a psychologist. And he studied, for a long time, he studied the art of decision making and how he can frame arguments better, what sort of evidence would be better in moving people to make what he thought to be the right decision in certain circumstances. And after decades of this research, he gave up because he felt like it was impossible. There was no piece of evidence. There was no number that would ever sway even an expert, even a decision maker, a policymaker. They needed stories. And so I think that that's something to really keep in mind, is stories are just a powerful way of engaging people, whether the general public or very senior policymakers, in your argument, and convince them whether it's to make a certain decision or to act. And the other thing that we'll talk more about today is just the value that stories have innately. So I was sort of thinking about all that when I was in grad school and trying to choose a topic for my master's thesis. And I came across an article, an op-ed in the Washington Post back in 2014 with a rather catchy headline. And the headline was, "The solutions to all the world's problems may be buried in PDFs that nobody reads." And I thought that was interesting. And so where that comes from is a report that was put out by the World Bank that some of you may be familiar with in 2014. And basically, the World Bank puts out 250 written reports every year. They spend about a quarter of their annual operating budget on those reports. So they have a pretty high stake in what influence and impact those written reports have. And the way they make these reports principally available is through downloadable PDFs on their website. So in 2014, one of the 250 reports that the World Bank did was a report looking at the success and the readership of its previous reports. And this graph sort of summarizes the results, which were disappointing. So they found that they looked at 5 years worth of reports, and of those 1,000 or so reports, they found that a third had not been downloaded a single time. They found that 88% of the reports had 0 citations, and that over 70% were downloaded less than 100 times, right? So if that's your principal form of engaging people with your knowledge and the research that you're doing, those numbers are not too inspiring. So that's what I decided to take on as my master's thesis, was looking at, okay, if written reports are not doing it anymore, if we need a new effective way to engage not only decision makers, but the general public in this really important research that's being done by think tanks like yourselves, perhaps as a filmmaker, I thought perhaps video could be an option. So I interviewed a number of think tank executives, people who work in communications, researchers, people who work on the video side, to sort of get their perspective on this, how they think about the World Bank problem, how they're thinking about video. and here's what I learned. I think there's a few really important takeaways to introduce this, which is, one, the World Bank problem, as a lot of you probably think, it's more complex than a single graph, right? There's no number of readership that's really, it's usually not about how many people you'll get to read something, but it's about who, right? So sometimes if you get one influential policymaker to read something, that's worth thousands of reads in a lay perspective. I spoke to someone at the Belfer Center at Harvard who said he often, his reports were kind of written for an audience of one because they were about very, very technical issues that really one person had the power to make the decision on. And he was really writing for that person. So it's more complicated than that. But the other thing that I think is really important to be thinking about is, think tanks, I think a lot of the value they offer and is not just their influence over policy decisions directly, but the way they think, the way they shape conversations that are happening in the policy world, the way that they're shaping the way both experts and the general public think about things, the way they're framing solutions and the problems themselves. And those sorts of dialogues are happening, they've always happened in the public square, but that public square is online, right? In order to really be influencing public conversation, you need to be influencing what's happening online. And what's happening online is increasingly video-based, right? You see it in Facebook and your Facebook feeds, they're increasingly dominated by video. Twitter slowly getting caught up in getting dominated by video. People, all these videos sort of everywhere. I'm doing research now for something else about Generation Z, right? So these are people who were born in 1996 and after, basically, today's high school students and college students. And with my generation, we also, we often talk about Googling something, right? Like if you don't understand something, you can Google it. If you want to learn how to do something, you can Google it. That generation talks about YouTubing things, right? So if you're interested in learning something new, you would YouTube it. If you want to learn a new skill, you YouTube it. So video is and is going to increasingly be the dominant online language. And so that's how the public square is going to be talking. It's going to be the language of the public square. So with that, I want to kind of turn it over to a quick chat to see your thoughts on sort of this World Bank problem. How has your organization dealt with it, if you've noticed it? And have you tried using video at all? If you have, what sort of goals were you trying to achieve and what sort of results? It looks like, I'm just looking at the chat and there's some sort of technical issue going on. Blue on the corner. Leandro, maybe you have some thoughts on how to resolve the blue box that seems to be in the corner?
Yes, sorry, it appeared to me in the first slides, it's not, it's been resolved. That's where
Okay,
it doesn't appear now. So let me just suggest, Michael, that besides the chat, if any of you want to also share your one answer to all these questions that Michael poses, you can also open your mic and do it like that, okay?
Would anyone like to jump in? No takers.
Hi, Michael. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi, it's Sam from the RSA here.
Hi, Sam.
I would say in speaking to the digital team here, whenever we've used video to date, we sort of seeing this problem of like every second has to be really interesting, because it's really easy to lose people. So where we embed our videos, how we frame them, is sort of traditionally people will look to us for written reports. So the way in which we frame video and the way in which obviously it's made is sort of a problem that we're not really sure how to overcome. So how long should the video be? How is it that we make every second as interesting as possible? Like how do we build that narrative so that people do want to keep watching for the whole video rather than getting 30 seconds in and going, oh yeah, I think I get it.
Right.
And then pausing and not continuing to the end.
Great. Great. Thank you very much, Sam. Anyone else feel like sharing a bit?
Hi, Michael. Can you hear me? Schwartz.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, Schwartz from Southern Hemisphere. Well, I'm just starting to deal with video. Like what we do a lot of work in consulting work, whereby we do social development work. We do researches for organizations. We do monitoring evaluation for organizations. So it's my first time dealing with video because my specialty is not really in video, but it's really interesting to see how many people have used video to portray their message. So basically what we are doing, we're going to start a series of social development webinars on monitoring evaluation. So it's actually my task to create those videos that promote to say we have this webinar on this day. So yeah, so it's my first time learning about it. So that'll be my first time using videos. Actually, so the goal here will be to portray the work that the organization does. That's one of the videos. And then the other one will then advertise the webinars. So that's just a little bit of my take on that. Sorry for I got a bit delayed in traffic, but yeah, that's a bit of my experience there.
Great.
Thanks.
Would anyone else like to share before we move on? Okay, so why don't let's continue. I'm going to open it up for another chat in just a moment for people who feel like speaking next. But I think one of the things, the first place that I looked when I was looking at how think tanks were thinking about video was what are their goals, right? And trying to form these general goals. And as we'll talk about more, for me, that's where every video project, like many communications project or any project campaign, needs to start, is what are we trying to achieve here? Until you're sort of on agreement, until you're in agreement on what you're trying to do, it's going to be hard to create a good roadmap to do that. So in speaking to different think tanks, these were sort of the four general goals that I found, was either trying to directly influence policy, and as you can see, I've sort of come up with the corresponding audiences for each of these. So when you're trying to influence policy, you're talking about policymakers, their staffs, other experts, often this sort of shaping public conversations, whether that was through events and panels or in this online public square. A lot of people spoke about video as being a way to just raise the stature of their think tank, whether this was just raising awareness of the think tank's work or raising awareness of their own experts. And then a big goal, which I think video can be really effective at, is sort of education and training, right? Trying to train people on best practices that the think tanks have been using in the field and are trying to get others to engage with. This can be a really powerful way to use video to really show a process, right? Where you can't necessarily do it in person. So I found both in projects that I've done and projects that I've spoken to others about, these seem to be actually where people are the most certain of the impact that their videos have had is around the education and training piece. But you can, like I said, I think of, first of all, you can have multiple goals with each video project, but it's very important to try to tie your goal to a specific audience or multiple audiences. And we'll talk more about this in pre-production, but I think it's important to start thinking about your audience. So like I said, I wanted to open it up again to conversation. What audiences are you guys thinking about with your work in general, but specifically with video? What audience are you trying to influence or engage? How have you been thinking about targeting them with your work? And we'll pick up more on this next week, but I'd be interested to hear now. And then the last concept that I want to talk more about is who is your audience's audience, right? Who are the people that they need to influence after they've been influenced by you? So if anyone who didn't speak last time might want to talk a little bit about how they've been thinking about audience, who their audience is, that'd be great.
Hi, this is Hannah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Hannah.
Hi. So I work for the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, And the audience for our videos were, I think, mainly the general public. So at the beginning, we started to, get some celebrities, some famous people to talk about their experience going in camps of refugees, and just give their testimonies about what's going on there, and what they try to share the testimonies of refugees. And later, we've started to do some very simple and short videos with always the same format. So they were in black and white, and it would be a staff from the IRC that would give some very specific facts about refugees and some numbers and the impact of refugees in some cities, etc. And so it was much shorter, and it was on our website, but we put it a lot on Facebook too. So our goal was really to raise awareness, share some key messages, so that people are able to answer, when some people are telling them that it's difficult to welcome refugees and all that, for example.
Great, thank you.
Anyone else care to share?
Yeah, hi, this is Priscilla.
Hi, Priscilla.
Okay, for us at CC, our most important audience are policymakers, really, and we try to target them using our policy briefs or reports, working papers, and others. But we are seeking to explore more innovative ways to reach out to them. We discovered that sometimes these policymakers might be very busy or too engaged in whatever it is they're doing to have time to actually sit and read through a whole lot of things. So perhaps if we get our research outputs in videos, it might actually ease and it might help get these messages across to them.
Yeah.
So that's why we actually want to
Great.
learn more about using video. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that's a good that's a good segue. So there'll be more opportunities to chat and share some of your thoughts. But I want to use that as a way to turn to this idea of policymakers, right? So in my interviews with think tanks, policymakers came up again and again as, if not usually the primary audience, but if not the primary audience, definitely the secondary audience. So think tanks, not surprisingly, seemed very, very focused on trying to influence policymakers. So after speaking with a number of think tanks, I thought the next logical step was to speak to policymakers about how they were engaging with think tank videos and how they could be an effective resource for them. And the news that I found was not great, right? So 85% of the policymakers that I spoke to said that videos produced by think tanks were not helpful at all to them. And you would think, okay, so maybe this thesis is wrong. Maybe video is not a good way for us to be engaging policymakers. Except that 85% also said they watch videos online every single day, at least one, if not multiple. And they watched online videos every single day that were about policy issues, right? So they were turning to places like the New York Times, like Vice, even RT was mentioned a couple times here in the US, which is surprising, but they were hungry for policy content in video form. It was just the think tank work was not doing it for them. So why not, right? So here are the four sort of primary reasons why not. They felt like the content was just not for them. It was too superficial, right? So this is where you get caught up in questions around audience, right? They felt the videos were made for a different audience, a very introductory level stuff that offered no value to them. The videos didn't give them a story, right? They were just sort of a reiteration. They felt more like executive summaries of a report, a different version, a video form of an executive summary that's just kind of summarizing some facts in the report, but it's not offering them any stories. And we'll talk a lot about the importance of stories. A focus on data and infographics, right? So for me, and this is starting to change, fortunately, but when I conjure up an image of a video produced by a think tank, I immediately go to voiceover, animation, and statistics, right? And I mean, think about yourself. When I want to engage with data, really try to understand it, I want to go at my own pace. I want to grapple with it. There's so many really powerful ways and tools, whether it's online interactives, data viz, that can be used to really present data in a way that people can engage with it on their own. That video is usually not a very effective format for that. So it was frustrating for policymakers. It might be helpful for someone who's just trying to grapple with a brief understanding of something, but with someone who really wants to engage with data so they can understand it and make decisions off it, video is not necessarily the best way to go about it. And then lastly, they found that they thought that the videos were just kind of boring, right? They weren't always well produced. Like I said, they didn't offer a story. This sort of goes to the problem that I think it was Sam brought up, the drop off, right? How do we keep it engaging throughout? They found that the videos were not engaging. So to me, so that's sort of the quick overview of why I think it's important to be thinking about video, but why I think it's also really important to be thinking strategically about how to use video effectively. So let's jump into that a little bit. I want to start with a little overview of the production process so you can get your better understanding, for those of you who are new to this, of what we'll be talking about, right? So like I said, there's sort of 3 phases to production. You have pre-production, which is sort of your strategy phase, where you're building up your strategy, you're finding your story. And at the end of the day, if you want to think about what comes out of this, you'll be putting together a production plan, which we'll talk more about, but that's really going to be your creative and logistical guide to this whole project. Production is when you're going to be out in the field filming things or recording things. And then post-production is when it all comes together, right? When you're bringing all the materials into a final finished product. And then the last step, as you can see at the bottom, is distribution, when you're actually getting it out there. But you'll notice that I don't just have distribution as a 4th step here. I sort of have it as a line going across the whole thing. And I think that's because distribution should not be an afterthought. It should not be something that you start once you've finished your video. It should be something that is ongoing throughout the entire production process. Even though it's the last thing that will happen, it shouldn't be the last thing that you do, because starting to think about distribution early will influence the way you make your video. It will influence the way you think about what can be done with your materials. It will really have important implications for the whole process. So I really encourage you to start thinking about your distribution strategy right from the very start. And again, that's something we'll delve more into next time. So let's talk about the 6 things that I think you really should be asking yourselves in pre-production. You can see the questions here, but we'll go through each of them one at a time. And I really think you should not move on. You shouldn't start filming things until you've answered and you're satisfied with your answers to all 6 of these questions. So what are your goals, right? That is, to me, the most important thing. Like I said, before you pick up any project, but definitely a video project, you need to know what you're trying to do, because that will impact the audience that you're focusing on. And yes, you will get the slides. The slides I'll post later, as well. There'll be a recording of this as well. But so you need to be figuring, it's going to influence, sorry, I think that's my chat screen that blocks stuff. So you need to be, your goals are going to influence your audience. They're going to be influencing the stories you tell, your distribution strategy, how you evaluate whether you've been effective or not. Coming up with really clear and concrete goals at the top, I think is good practice across the board, but definitely so in video making. And, we brought up a couple of goals already about what people are trying to do with video. You might be trying to raise money for your organization. You might be trying to affect specific decisions. Those are going to be very different looking videos. And like I said, you might have multiple goals, and at the end of the day, you might have multiple videos to achieve those goals. But the more certain you are of things up front, I think the better you'll be. Stemming from that, and we've covered this a bit, is your audience. Answering the question of who is our audience. There was a video that I posted in the background note. I'm not sure that if all of you got to see it, but watch it. But it's a video that I made on Think Tanks TV about New America, and a report that they did thinking about multiple audiences that they had. So the report was about using technology to increase early learning and early literacy. And they realized that they held multiple audiences, right? They had policymakers who they were trying to influence around policy decisions. They had educators who they were trying to convince to bring technology into the classroom. They had parents who they were trying to convince to bring technology into their reading routines at home. And all of those audiences had very different ways of engaging information. So they did a campaign that had multiple products, from policy reports and op-eds to videos to a book to community action plans to teaching guides, right? I think when you think about your audience, you're really helping yourself understand, one, what should our video look like? And two, what sort of complementary materials will be effective in getting the most out of that experience? Another really great example of this is when I was interviewing think tanks, I spoke with someone at the Council on Foreign Relations, and they do great video work. I think they've won some Emmys for some of their work. But we spoke about audience, and they told me, the person I was speaking to said at the beginning they saw their audience as just about everyone, right? Oh, this is foreign policy, it affects everyone. We want to really be engaging the whole world, right? And that was just overwhelming to them. It was almost paralyzing. How do you engage the whole world in something? And then they decided to kind of tweak themselves, and they said, actually, our videos are going to be for education purposes. We're going to target them at educators and students who are interested in learning and teaching about foreign policy. And that to them was a game changer. It helped them focus, right? They focused on, okay, so what kind of videos do we want to produce to be the most educationally effective? And they realized, one, we don't need to only limit ourselves to using people at CFR in our videos. We can engage the smartest people on whatever subject. So that influenced the videos themselves. Then two, when we get these videos out there, how are they going to be most effective in accomplishing our goals of making better a better educational experience on foreign policy? And so they created classroom discussion guides, curricula, things that teachers could then use that were specifically designed for their videos, right? So you can really only start to engage with those sorts of questions when you're very specific about who your audience is. And so I'd really encourage you, as soon as you know your goal is tied to your audience, and nail those two things down before you move on. And like I mentioned before, at the bottom here, you can see you've got yourself, your audience, and then your audience's audience, right? If you're trying to engage a policymaker's staff, their audience is going to be their principal, right? So you're using your video to influence them, but what will they need to then pass on to their principal? If you're trying to influence the policymaker themselves, who else do they need to convince, right? Who's their audience? Are they elected? Do they have constituents that they'll need to then influence? Do they have colleagues in their policy body that they'll need to engage to work with them? If you're trying to engage teachers, they'll need to engage their students, right? So thinking about the layers of your audience can be helpful in thinking about what video will be best to be passed on, what iterations of that video you can create, and again, what sort of materials you can complement your work with. This one, I don't think enough people are asking themselves. Like I said, I do think there's inherent value to video in itself these days because of some online platforms. But let's also be honest and realistic that video can be an expensive medium to work with, both in terms of budget, but also just time and staff resources. So you want to be making sure that you're getting the most bang for your buck. And quite frankly, a lot of things that are in video form today don't need to be video, right? They can and might be more effective as podcasts. They might be more effective as something that's written or a photo or some sort of web interactive. So what are the things that justify a video, right? What is video good at? What I call, what's called cinematic value. Where does video add value? And to me, these are four. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but I think these are really four important things to be thinking about in terms of, can we do this with our video? One, can we put a personality to the issue we're trying to address, right? So for years we talked about the poster child, right? The poster boy for an issue. And that's a great term for posters and for photos. But when we're talking about video, there's a great opportunity to move beyond just the poster child, right? You can give a poster personality, which is going to be that dynamic person who can engage us, not only in the issue, but help us understand that this is a problem that affects other people, living, breathing people with personalities, with dreams and families. And so can you really show, do you have a personality, whether they're a famous personality or an average person that everyone can identify with who's experiencing the issue? Can you find a personality that will help people identify and empathize with the issue? Is there a revealing story you can tell? Video is, I think, one of the most powerful storytelling mediums that we have. The problem with a lot of online videos is they're not used to tell stories, right? So is there a really good story here that we can be telling visually, right? And we'll talk more about this in a moment, but showing the story, not just using video as an audio platform to tell someone, but a real visual platform to show them the problem or the story as it unfolds. Is there for more abstract problems, right, or theoretical? I know someone posted on the message boards about dealing with abstract issues and theoretical things. Well, what's the visual analogy that you can use? Is there a visual example or metaphor that you can use to engage people in that abstraction while they're hearing about it, right? And so on this thumbnail on the page here is from a video that was put out a few years ago by the Brookings Institution on the subject of social mobility and social inequality. And this is an economist who's sort of the star of the video talking about his research. And he's using these Lego blocks to represent the change or lack of change in social mobility over time in the US. And it's a really effective visual analogy. It's a really effective way to engage people in information that can be hard to grasp. So, and as you can see, this is, in terms of viewership, quite successful. It had almost 300,000 views. Brookings, I know, got a lot of traction from it. So what's the visual analogy you can be creative about to help people grasp a complicated issue? And then the last thing is, people really do like to see a historical moment or hear something from the horse's mouth, right? So when I see a speech online in a news source or other places, there's often the video of the speech and then there's the transcript right below. And even though that's really not a visual experience, there's something about seeing it from the horse's mouth that I think encourages people to choose video over just reading the transcript. There's something valuable offered there. So make sure before you decide to go down this road of video production, before you invest your time and your resources in it, make sure you have something really valuable to offer through your video. Okay, so now let's talk about story, right? Because I think, like I said, I think this is one of the most underused aspects of the video medium in a lot of think tank work. It's getting, I've been pleased to see that more and more think tanks are really trying to use video to tell stories. But I think it should be the place you start. How can we tell a story around this? So, policy is so, I was originally drawn to policy as a filmmaker because there are so many impactful and powerful stories in that space, right? Important stories. So what are the stories? And the way I would think about this is when you're taking the issue that you're working on, really think about, okay, who are the people that this problem is about, that this report is about, this solution is addressing? Who are those people? Then once you identify those people, what does their world look like? And what does this problem look like through their eyes, right? The more, or if you're talking about a solution, a program that your organization has been working on, what does this program look like through their eyes? That's real value add that you can give even to a policymaker who might have just read your 100-page report, right? That's still something that will be incredibly valuable. To let them see something, let them see it in real time is incredibly important. And like I said, don't just get your researcher who was there to tell me about the experience or tell me the facts from her report. Let me see it for myself. Let me engage with the people who I don't ordinarily get to engage with and see the problem or the solution from their eyes. And what I've got here on this slide, maybe it's a little bit more detail than we really need to go into. But this is what's, the classic narrative arc. When you talk about a narrative arc, it's actually an arc that's about rising tension and action. But you can see it starts in sort of this exposition phase where you're really trying to introduce the audience to a new world, an unknown world. And again, policy is often about unknown worlds, right? These are problems that a lot of people don't always understand because they don't experience it on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes they do, and they see it for themselves, but often they don't. So show them that world, and show them that world using a guide, right? A main character, if you will. Someone whose personality you can serve as the personality of the problem. Someone that can serve as what I call an empathy channel, right? The person whose perspective we're seeing this problem from. I think that, to me, that is really what makes something engaging. When Sam brought up the keeping something engaging every minute, right? I don't think you need like a flashy effect or an explosion like you would in a Hollywood movie every minute to keep people's attention. What you need is a really good story and a main character who really draws our affection, our empathy, and our attention. And then what you want is conflict. There's some sort of conflict that they're up against that we're going to watch them overcome. And you want to see, as a result of them overcoming that conflict, some sort of change, right? And again, the good news here is that the policy world is full of conflict and change, right? It's literally about changing people's lives. So how can you document those changes? How can you show what those conflicts are? And they just don't have to be, ginormous Hollywood conflicts. There are conflicts of everyday life that, told in a compelling way through the eyes of a compelling person, can be really engaging and really important. The other things about good stories is that they're just inherently valuable. Forget the fact that, it's been scientifically shown that people just engage with information better with stories. They learn more when they're engaged through a story. But stories themselves are valuable to people, to your audiences, right? So like I said, this take me to the field aspect. This gives policymakers a perspective on an issue that they can't get anywhere else, right? They can't get in a written report. It gives them something, no matter how many facts and how much evidence they've read about the issue, it gives them that almost a personal experience of seeing it from themselves. Again, back to the analogy I talked about, it allows them to go from the up here world, the systems and numbers, to really understand the issue on an individual level. And then more practically, like I said, they all have their own audiences that they need to convince. And stories are very valuable for them to be repackaged and into speeches, into their own communications through emails. And then they can share them easily online as their own stories, their own videos. Let them take full advantage of your stories and use the value of your story to promote your work. And now they're, convince their own constituents. So I know I've been throwing out a lot. I'm just checking out the chat. Is there any questions or anything you guys want clarified before we continue on a bit? Okay. So what I want to do now is just let you guys watch. Let's watch together a short clip of a video. This is one of the most powerful short videos I've seen about policy-related stuff. This was put out by the New York Times last year. It's actually nominated for an Oscar for Best Short Documentary. It's about the refugee crisis in Greece off of Lesbos. But someone brought up, that time being an issue in terms of keeping people's attention. This video is about a half an hour long, right? And it got tons of viewership and really engaged people. So runtime does not have to be the issue. It's about finding the compelling stories. Because this is a half hour long, I'm only going to show the first 3 minutes of it. So it's just a teaser of it. And then after, we can come back and have a little bit of a conversation about what we think it was doing well. But the full video, for those of you who want to keep watching, is on the course page under the Interesting Videos tab. So I'm just going to share. I'm switching out the screen so we all can watch it. Okay, so we'll just watch about 3 minutes of this, and then we'll come back and discuss it.
ποιες εξεκινήσεις από εδώ προς την Τουρκία. Εμείς μαζέψαμε μια βάρκα και οι άλλες οι δύο πάνε μπροστά και φύγανε. Ταξιδεύουν. Το 2001 στο νησί μας είχαν έρθει 20 άτομα αφγανικής υπηκότητας και θυμάμαι ότι είχε γίνει η είδηση της χρονιάς. Το 2015 που ζούμε τώρα, τα πράγματα είναι το άκρος αντίθετο. Τα πράγματα ήταν ελεγχόμενα, ήρεμα. Η αναλογία είναι ασύγκριτη. 10 άτομα κάθε ώρα που περνάει. Καλούμαστε να φέρουμε εις πέρας μια εισρωή ανθρώπων της τάξης 200 άτομα την ώρα. Η βάρκα πού είναι?
Δεν ξέρω, βαρκά έναν άνθρωπο που λέει πάνω σε ένα ξύλο. Έτσι την έπαιρνε στο σταθμό.
Καλώς, θα πάμε εμείς.
Έφυγες. Έλα, φύγε, Κυριάκο.
Εντάξει, θα περάσουμε τώρα.
Είναι οκ όλα.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. Sorry. And like I said, that's just that's just a taste of it, and I definitely encourage you all to watch the whole thing. But I think even from that 3-minute piece, there's a lot of really important things going on that are worth talking about a little bit. So I'd be curious to hear from some of you. In general, what sort of caught your attention? What did you notice about it? And specifically related to some of the things we've just been talking about already, is there anything that's jumped out at you so far?
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so one of the things I noticed is in the beginning, they were shooting using GoPro camera or like a head cam or something,
Right.
something like a mounted camera. So this is basically, they're showing it from the perspective of the rescuers, the guys who are at sea actually picking up refugees from the sea.
Yeah.
And another thing I also noticed, which I liked, and it ties in exactly to what you were saying before, the elements of a story, is the change aspect. Because this guy was talking about like how they rescued about only 10 refugees back in 2001.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point in 2015, I think the video was from 2015,
Mm-hmm.
they're looking at 200 refugees every hour.
Right.
And he's saying the life really has changed, not just for the refugees, but also for them, because it's become part of their daily routine to pick people from the sea. So it's definitely looking at things both from the perspective of the refugees, even if we haven't quite gotten into any one of the accounts of the experiences, but from the first 3 minutes, definitely I think it's pretty much about the guys who are rescuing guys from the sea. It's from the savior perspective.
Absolutely. So I think a couple of things I want to point out from what you said. So yes, that it's the second shot, right? The first shot we see is just a shot out the window, and then the second shot you see is from the from the captain's perspective as he's engaging engaging one of the refugees, right? This is, it's literally throwing you, the viewer, right into it. This was a technique actually that Hitchcock was one of the first people, Alfred Hitchcock was one of the first people to really do. He would have, it's now sort of trite, but on screen he would have his killers point the gun directly at the camera, right? So that the audience would feel as if the gun was being shot at them. So really just engaging your audience, letting them, this is really showing you the problem right away. Great, thank you. Anyone else have anything they want to speak about?
Hi, my name is Marie-France, and like Hannah who spoke earlier, I work with the International Rescue Committee, and this video feels in many ways so personal because we work on the refugee crisis and these humanitarian contexts. One of the things that really struck me is not only that they have that personal perspective, but there is even like shots of, for example, these two women on the boat at one point looking at each other, and just these little intimate moments that really make them feel very human, even though it's not their specific perspective that's being highlighted, but it feels very kind of intimate and very personal, and I appreciated that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, again, they're drawing out the humanity of it all, right? They're using, for lack of a better word, they're using them as sort of empathy channels to engage you and get to, I always think about video in these ways is really trying to show the audience a piece of themselves in whoever they're watching, right? Let them find those little moments, and it's gonna be different for everyone else, but find those really human moments so that people can say, oh, I see myself there. That's a really powerful way of getting people to care, getting people motivated, whether they're, a teenager or a senior policymaker. We're all moved by the same emotions and the same empathy channels. Anyone else care to share something?
Brigitte here. I did watch the whole video, and I have to say I was absolutely stunned by it, even though I consider myself quite well informed of the issue.
Yeah.
But it's struck a very strong chord, and to the point where the tears were just flowing. And I think it starts, the flavor we got there is certainly showing all those things, but then it gets increasingly raw, chaotic, and what is, in terms of the intimacy of the story, you also really get a sense of the impact of this going on for years, and the mental as well as the physical impact of a small community trying to deal with this. So I'm glad that it's done very well, and hope that it actually contributes to some change. Yeah. And just on the note of the intimacy, I recently went to a conference where somebody talked about intimacy but translated it into me see, which I thought was quite a neat way to put it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That was very helpful. A couple of things I want to pull out from that. One, you mentioned, you've been engaged with this issue for some time. Obviously, this is not a new issue, unfortunately, but that this still had quite an impact on you. And when I saw this video last year, I felt exactly the same way. I had been reading a lot of things about refugees pouring into Greece and other parts of Europe. I'd done a lot of research around it, and yet I was still moved in a unique way by this, right? And that's what I meant earlier. I think it's a great example of the value that a story has for everyone. No matter how engaged they are, you have the opportunity by using video effectively to offer them something new, which is very difficult, I think, to do in a policy space at times. And then the other thing that you mentioned was, and this was brought up in the first comment as well, this sort of being told from the perspective of the rescuers, right? And it is the main character that we're introduced to here, the ship captain. This will sort of be his story in one sense. We're seeing this from his perspective. And that he offers us an engaging personality, right? He is, maybe he's not the empathy channel for the issue in every way, but he's an engaging personality that we can come to care about. Even in the first couple of minutes, we see he's this dedicated person who'll go out of his way to go and deal with these issues. He'll literally drop a meal without paying to go head for the water, right? So we're learning a lot about him, and he will be this personality of the issue that I mentioned. And then the video is really, as it was just brought up, it's making this case about the struggle that this small town is dealing, the huge burden on this town. And for those of you who watch the whole thing, not to give anything away from the end, but there's this incredibly powerful line at the end of the video where someone says, you know, we can't be dealing with this alone, right? We can't be dealing this all by ourselves. And that's really the call to action, right? This is about the struggle of one small town dealing with this burden of a huge refugee crisis and the need for more of the world to get involved in it. I think it does a great job of showing you not only the human trauma of the refugees themselves, but the burden on this town and how much it's affected them. Great. Any other quick comments before we move on? Wonderful. Thank you all. I really encourage you to watch the whole thing. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say was, you know, again, talking about this, Birgitta just mentioned that the intensity kept getting drawn up, right? The heat got brought up and it got more intense, which it does. In the film world, we call that raising the stakes, right? So as the story goes on, you know, the stakes at the beginning of the story will not be enough to keep our interest for the whole thing. So we need to constantly make things, the stakes higher, make the tension higher, make the risk of failure higher. And I think that's another way of engaging people for the long haul of the video is finding the compelling story, but making that story increasingly compelling by raising the stakes as you go on. So let's move from this sort of theoretical, what makes a good video, into some of the practical talk, and start with talk about the budget, because I know in this space that's a very important piece. First of all, I think let's talk about some fact, which is that video production is expensive. It's a really, of many mediums, it's one of the more expensive, certainly more expensive than a written word, more expensive than audio. But I think one of the things we'll talk more about next week is how to get the most value out of what you're investing in video, right? I think the first thing to do is try to think about video as an investment rather than an expense, because I do think it is a product that will offer great value to you as an organization. And there are just different techniques you can use, strategies you can use to kind of squeeze as much value out of that investment as possible. But it is expensive. And I often find that people who try to do it cheaply, try to do it by themselves using nothing but an iPhone, will often end up spending more, right? Because they'll need to, one of two things will happen. They'll need to go to someone to really fix it and end up paying a lot more because these things weren't thought out beforehand. Or they'll just continue, they'll do it on their own using the iPhone, and what they'll be left with is something that's not as effective. So even though it was cheaper, the efficiency of it is not great because they don't get nearly enough value out of it as they should have. And that's not to say that you can't make a really successful video using nothing but an iPhone, right? It happens. And one of the videos that I asked you to watch, which we'll talk about next week, was not done on an iPhone, but it was made for something like $300, right? So it doesn't have to be enormously expensive. And the more that you think about things, right, the more that you're strategic up front, I think you can help, if not save money, you can definitely help at least get the most out of that money. So like I said, you can, if you think through some of these questions, the 6 questions beforehand, you'll get the most value. And then the other thing to really keep in mind is that having a really powerful story, even if it's told on an iPhone, right? Even if it's not a Hollywood version of your story, if it's a really good story, it will win over good production value every time. The one caveat being, and this was something that was told to me when I first started making films, and I think it's one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever gotten, right? You can get away with kind of bad video, right? If your visuals are shaky, if they're a little out of focus or hard to watch all the time, you can get away with it in certain circumstances with a really good story, with really compelling footage. If you have bad audio, no one's going to watch it, right? No one wants to watch something that hurts their ears to watch. No one wants to watch something that they can't understand. So definitely trying to find a way to favor getting really good audio if you are going to go the sort of iPhone route. I think that's really important to keep in mind, is how can we make sure at the end of the day we're at least getting good, clean, crisp audio. Again, on the practical side to talk about is, okay, so who should we work with, right? Some of you may have in-house capabilities, which is great, and then you have sort of a dedicated partner that you just need to think through these questions with, but many of you will be seeking out people to work with to help you with this. And here are just quickly, some things to be thinking about. Obviously, the price is something important to consider, looking at their past work. But then I think, now that you're learning some of the questions that you should be asking, are they asking these questions of you, right? Are they asking you what your goals and your audience are? Are they helping you think about this in terms of a story about an individual, right? Are they thinking the right thoughts and asking the right questions? And are they collaborators, right? Do they acknowledge this as your vision that they're being brought on to help carry out, or do they really want control over the vision? And I think that's the difference between when you as an organization bring on a filmmaker to make something for you versus when filmmakers approach you to participate in something that they're working on, which they're working on should mean self-financed by them, and in which case it's their vision that you're buying into. But in this case, it should definitely be people who are willing to work with your vision and make that vision better. In this space, they should understand the issue you're working on, or at least be willing to do research to understand it, right? Like, for me, I have a policy background, which is helpful in a lot of these cases, but I don't understand every policy issue in depth, certainly as much as the researchers that I'm working with. So I start every project before I'm hired by researching it and trying to understand, right, this part, the macro, the systems and numbers part, so that I can help translate it into the story and individual part. And you should find a partner that's willing to do the same thing. And then this, I think, is really important, especially when you're doing field work and telling stories from the field, is trying to engage filmmakers who are of that community. I think that is, it's a really important way of elevating that community's voice, right? I think one of the things I love about video and storytelling is it can help bring these people who are often marginalized and their voices aren't heard. It helps bring their voices into the halls of power, right? And I think that's really powerful and important. And having the filmmaker be of that community is even one step further. They'll obviously understand that issue in a more intimate way, in a way that's of the perspective of the people going through it. And then they'll have more trust and access to that community as well. So they'll be able to deliver a more compelling product at the end of the day, just because they already have that trust. Obviously, you're not always going to be able to work with filmmakers of the communities that you're working with, but trying to at least get them engaged in the process, be collaborators, part of your crew if they can, or at least engaged in knowing what they're contributing to and buying into it. And the last thing is to make sure that you have a really well thought out production plan that covers your creative and your logistics, which we'll jump into in a second, but I just want to pause quickly to see if there's any questions related to anything we've covered so far. Great. Okay, so let's move on then. Was that a question that was coming? Okay. Well, so let's move on and talk about production for our last 20 minutes or so. So we'll start with the production plan, right? So this is sort of your blueprint for the full process, right? This is going to be a creative guide and a logistical guide that's covering everything from, what kind of crew do we need? What story are we telling? To how many days do we need to tell that story? It's including the travel, the logistics around your media management. Sometimes you'll be able to do storyboards and scripts depending on the types of video that you're making. Often, if it's something like the video we just watched, you can't script that, but you can outline it, right? You can cover what sort of things you want to be filming just so you can be ready for it. And then the one, these things really need to be done on a sort of case-by-case basis in terms of planning it out. But the one thing to really keep in mind is that video takes time. Really good video takes time. And the more at ease you and your team can be while making something, the better things will come out. So I often always get calls for, we just want, come by, do an interview, it'll be quick, it'll be a 2-minute interview, right? There's no such thing as that. When I'm doing an interview, I get there usually an hour before to set things up, get it looking right, get the frame right, get the lights right. I plan on at least having 25 minutes with the person I'm interviewing if I can. Obviously, you can't always, depending on what their schedules are, but really kind of extending the time to get the most out of it, leaving time for things to go wrong and to troubleshoot. And then also, especially when you're doing field work, leaving time for the unexpected, for you to find those moments that are not in the outline, but are really going to be those personal, intimate moments that people will remember the most, they'll be the most impactful. Post-production plan is a similar idea, but for the editing side. And with this, I really just wanted to give people a good sense of all the moving parts that are involved in this post-production process, right? Because I think a lot of people tend to think of it as just taking what was filmed and slapping it together, but there are a lot more elements to post-production, right? There's obviously the editing, the editorial, but then any sort of graphics and animations, and that can be something as simple as a text that will be very easy to do, to complicated motion graphics and animation. There's going to be music selection and licensing costs involved in that. Any additional footage that you didn't film, that needs to be licensed. Obviously, you want to leave time for revisions and comments so you can give back to your collaborators. And then the last piece, it's not always necessary, but when you can afford it and you have the time, doing a final mastering process where you're really getting the audio mix right, that can make I think people underestimate the value of it, but having a really good quality audio mix can just make a huge difference. Like I said, audio, I think of as a more important element often than the visual in terms of quality. Color correction is just a way of getting the brightness levels and the color levels all looking perfect. But that's all that's encompassed in the post-production plan. And again, that may be more than you need, but I think it's helpful to understand all the moving parts. Any quick questions related to those logistics?
Hi, Michael. I would like to ask a question when it comes to the post-production part. Just want to ask, do you have like what is your advice for me, like a standard, something that you're starting for production, something decent to say, an entry level that'll make you a nice, decent piece of work? Like, for example, I've been working with Adobe, some of the Adobe products, but they were a trial version. So just in case if I don't manage to get the full product, what software can you recommend in terms of the whiteboard animation, trying to talk about the work that we do? Is there something that is decent, that is low budget that you can start with?
So again,
good.
Yeah, so what you're buying with I work with Adobe suites, and what you're getting from that is really the capabilities to do more complex things, right? Effects, a lot of multiple channel editing, depending on what you're doing, right? Like Apple computers come with iMovie, which is, for what it is, it's a pretty effective editing tool that can be used for if you're doing something basic like a whiteboard animation, you could probably get away with iMovie to do it. There's also increasingly, there's online video editing services that I think they might be free, or if not free, they're cheap. I can look into some of the names. I've never used them, but I know of people who have. But yeah, I would start with iMovie and see if you can take care of it there, and if not, look elsewhere. For Windows, that's a good question. I'm less familiar with Windows. So all the Adobe products are good for Windows, but something cheap and easy. I don't know if Windows comes with any editing software. I'd have to look that up for you. I'll look into it. But I think these online softwares, these online programs that I mentioned, they do work with Windows as well. Okay.
Hey, Mike.
Yes.
What did you mean by the editorial?
Editorial is just editing. So that's when I say editing and editorial, they're sort of synonymous.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to use that to sort of cover, again, kind of coming out of the research that I did. These were a few what I found to be best practices of ways to think about things to incorporate in your video that I found made for the most effective videos. And this first one is the idea of using emotion over information. Another piece of advice unsolicited that I got when I started making movies was that video and film is a terrible medium for conveying information, but one of the best we have for conveying emotion. And I don't fully agree with that. I think video can be a pretty powerful way of conveying information as well, if it's done well. But undisputably, I think it's one of the best media for conveying emotion, and all types of emotion, right? And I would encourage you to think a lot about humor here. Humor, in one of the interviews I did, someone referred to humor as a gateway drug or a gateway emotion. And I would not underestimate that, right? If you look at what's going on here in the US with The Daily Show and John Oliver's show, right? That's all about using humor to engage people in complicated issues, really digging deep into some of them, all through humor, and they're able to keep people engaged. This video here is also on the course platform called Dumb Ways to Die. This is far from the think tank world. This is a PSA that was made by, I think this was made by the New Zealand Metro Authority. Basically, it's a PSA about why you should stand back when the subway is approaching, right? Stand behind the yellow line. And it's these animated characters singing a song about dumb ways to die. And it gets 100 million views on YouTube, right? 100 million views. There are sequels to this, right? There's Dumb Ways to Die Part 2 and 3. Like you're talking about sequels to PSAs. That's something you don't usually hear of. And if your goal is to make people aware of the fact that they can get killed by a subway, getting 100 million people to sit down and watch your message is pretty effective. So think about emotions and how you can use those in your video. Think about humor. The other really great thing about emotion is sharing activity online on platforms like Facebook is driven mostly by emotion, right? People will often share things that move them emotionally rather things that they feel inform them. So it will help you with your distribution to have video that is emotionally driven. This quote here is my favorite quote that I came across in all of my thesis research, right? So this was a policymaker. When I said that 85% of policymakers watch at least one online video every day, he was among the 15% that does not. We were having this long conversation where I was trying to figure out what would get him to engage with the video, what he was missing, and there was nothing. He would not budge from the fact that videos were not useful to him. There was no way that they would be, until finally he said, you know what, if Wes Anderson made a movie about ISIS, I'd probably watch that. And this struck Wes Anderson, for those who don't know him, he's one of my favorite filmmakers. He's made a bunch of movies. These are stills from 2 of them. He makes sort of comedy drama movies that are quirky. The top one is from a movie called The Life Aquatic, the bottom from a movie called The Royal Tenenbaums. And just from these 2 snapshots, right, you can see a consistency between them. You can see a sense of authorship in his films that are in an instant you can recognize a Wes Anderson movie. I think when you make a video for your think tank, when you make multiple videos for your think tank, you should be striving to create that sort of brand authorship that Wes Anderson has, that personality that comes across through his films. John Schwartz of Soapbox Communications in London wrote a really great piece that's on the On Think Tanks platform based on a presentation he gave at the On Think Tanks conference that was all about the importance of branding, right? That branding is one of those lessons that the advertising world learned long ago, but the think tank world and the policy world has not yet learned really well. And I think that sort of branding should be part of the videos as well. I should see your videos and know that they're from your institution. And that should come with a sense of personality, a sense that there is a person behind this camera. Again, referencing the video we all watched together a few moments ago, there was one point where they call in the filmmaker. They said, put the camera down and help us. This sense of humanity, I think you want to be in front of you on the screen, but the more you can feel it coming from behind the screen, especially when you're an organization and you're trying to create a brand and a sense of humanity as your organization and institution, I think that's really powerful and important. This one I think is, so the idea of combining research and production, right? When I think about making a good documentary, one of the hardest pieces, one of the most difficult parts of it is the access piece, right? How can I get access to this community, to this story? How can I get these field interviews? And for those of you who organizations are doing field research, you are already overcoming that challenge, right? You're doing half the battle, the more difficult part, right? Now all you need to do is bring a camera along, right? Either engage your researchers to use cameras on their own, or bring a production team along, because having that access to those stories and not using them and not documenting them through film, to me, that's such an opportunity lost. And you can see here on the left, this is a video that was put out alongside a written report called Living Under Drones that was done by the NYU School of Law and Stanford Law School a few years back. And the researchers went into Pakistan and they interviewed a lot of people about the effects that US drone strikes were having in the region. And as you can see, this is a pretty low budget shoot on the left, right? It's I don't know if it's an iPhone or a low grade camera, but it's nothing too complicated that the researchers did themselves. And now they have documented video of all these interviews. And what I love about it is because the interviews they filmed are the same as the interviews they reference in their written work, there's an interactivity, right? There's an interrelatedness between the written piece and the video where they can link to the video from the written report that makes it really engaging. And on the right is a still from an Oscar-nominated documentary called Dirty Wars that was documenting the writing of a book called Dirty Wars by Jeremy Scahill, and that's Jeremy Scahill in the middle. And it's the same sort of thing. This one was more professionally done, right? So this is with a full film crew, but it's the same ideas where he's going out into the field to meet these people and learn this story anyhow. Let's get a camera with him and document that. And there's a lot we can do there. So that's something I would really encourage you to think about, whether it's something the researchers can be doing or incorporating those costs into grants for the research so that you can be documenting these stories on the go. And then the last thing that I want to talk about, I was warned in my thesis that I couldn't call this a best practice. I had to call it an untested but promising idea. So I'm cheating by calling it a best practice here. But I really think this is something really promising that video can do that think tanks, I'd love to see them doing more of. When I spoke to policymakers about how they engage with think tanks generally, forget video for a moment, but how they engaged think tanks, there kept on being this repetition that one think tank alone wasn't necessarily all that helpful. It was think tanks in aggregate, having perspectives from multiple think tanks that really help them think through an issue in a new light. John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, what he tried to do as often as he could, which was not as often as he would have liked, was to have think tank roundtables, where he would engage a number of think tanks representing multiple points of view and multiple ideas, and bring them together to talk about it, give him their perspective so he can hear multiple ideas. And this is something that video can do really well. It can bring together different perspectives, and even if, bring them into the same space. And that means, I don't mean that you need to basically have a panel discussion. You can be doing these in separate interviews or choosing separate stories and through the editing process, bring them together. But I think that's something that would be really valuable, not only to policymakers, but to the general public, right? One of the big problems we're having today is social bubbles and people only listening to perspectives they already agree with. And if we can use reliable sources to bring together evidence-based perspectives that may be different from each other, I think there's a real value in that. And I would encourage you to think about trying to aggregate perspectives either within your own think tank into the same video, or thinking about partnering with others. And I know that might sound like, why do I want to promote someone else's perspective? But I think if you're creating a valuable product, that product will get out there and will be seen, and you'll be a part of it, and your perspective will be more widely heard. So it's something, again, untested and unproven, but promising, I think, and I would definitely encourage you to think about that. So that's basically all I wanted to cover. We've got a few minutes left, so why don't we open it up to any questions about these best practices quickly first.
Hi, Mike.
Hi.
So I have two questions. One is on the best practices, actually on the first point for emotion over information.
Yeah.
And I'll try to relate it to the organization that I work for, seeing as, I work for AFIDEP, which is the African Institute for Development Policy.
Okay.
And the people that we primarily work with policymakers. I think someone else mentioned that they work with policymakers as well. So it might be for us, unless there's an idea that is hovering somewhere in your head and you'd be willing to give it to me. It's a bit difficult to imagine a situation where I can make that video scene with a policymaker to be emotive, not just informational.
So when you say your audience is with policymakers, do you mean that the people you're filming with are policymakers, or the people that you're trying to show the video to are policymakers?
Actually, both.
Right.
Yeah.
But so I guess what I would encourage you to do, I think the audience side of that, policymakers, I think, are moved by emotion. They're human beings, just like you and I, and they're definitely moved by emotion. And again, emotional stories will have resonance with their audience as well. So I think on the audience side, I think there's a very strong argument why emotion will be helpful to you. On the sort of subject side, the fact that you're interviewing only policymakers, I guess that's where I would push back and ask you why you're only doing that. I think there are times when that's valuable, but if your audience is policymakers and you're showing them policymakers, why don't they just pick up the phone and call? Why don't they call each other and have that conversation? What value are your videos bringing to them? Your videos need to be giving them something that they can't get on their own, that they can't get from reading your reports. And so, for example, I did a video that was actually shown to the commissioners of the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, right? So this was part of a legal brief about a negligent fire in Mexico that killed a lot of little children. And we used an emotional story told by the parents of the victims to bring their voices, to bring the community voices into the halls of power, but to bring those stories, more importantly, those important emotional stories as part of this legal brief, right? So your legal brief is giving you all the facts of the case, the information, the legal arguments, and the video is bringing in the emotional story. So I think that's something I would ask you to think a little bit about, is why you're only focusing on the policymaker side. Maybe it's convenience and it makes sense, but I'd push you to be a little bit, to push yourself more to think about other ways.
The first question, I would definitely do that. Now for the second question, you haven't touched on this, but it was something I was thinking about before when you went through the best practices, and I saw that it wasn't mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know exactly what you think about vox pops. When you take it to the streets with like a roadie, like a roadman, like you go with a mic and camera and try to interview.
So I've done some vox pop. I'll put a vox pop that I did on the website, on the course site for you to check out. I think those can be really good if done well, right? I think the problem with them is they can get boring. So finding a way to keep them engaging, and the one that I'll post, we did that through music and through really some nice visuals just to keep it engaging. But I think that's doing a service in that it's bringing outside voices that people wouldn't normally get. So I do think there's value in those things, and they can be fun. I think, again, use humor, use emotions, right? They can be emotional. I don't think they rule out the other best practices. There's a question on the chat that I just want to address, because this is something that I get a lot. So that I'm personally convinced, but people in my organization maybe aren't. So what sort of tips are there for internal advocacy? One, I think making the case to them, right? Who is our audience, and why is our audience a video audience? Again, I think more and more of the places that you're trying to have an impact, you're going to need to be able to speak in the language of video. So start with some of those arguments. Talk about your specific goals, and make the case why your goals will be addressed through video. And then I think the best way of winning buy-in is through examples. If you can point to successful campaigns that your peer institutions have done, or similar institutions, why has video been successful to them? And also maybe you can start small and do something small internally just to build up the momentum. You don't need to start with the $100,000 project. You can start with a small one, just with small goals and a small piece to just try to make your case slowly. But find examples, ideally in your field, but find examples of others that have worked, and I can help you try to find those examples if you'd like. The multiple point of view question that's also on the chat here, in the think tank space, I don't really have many, and that's because, like I said, it's untested and untried. I think, in films, in documentary films, you see this all the time, right? You see really, really good documentaries are offering you more than one perspective on an issue, and they're creating an environment for those two perspectives to collide. There is a great film called, I got to remember it, but it was, I don't want to misspeak, so I'll send it out, but there's a great film that was about these two, conservative and a liberal who would debate all the time. And it was about their debates. And the film was more about the importance of that sort of debate and also the history of theirs, but I thought it was a great way of bringing two perspectives together. Wonderful. So that's basically all the time that we have for today. That brings us to the hour and a half. The one other thing we didn't get to, but you can do that on your own a little bit, is I just wanted you guys to start. So the assignment that I'll give to you next week is going to be asking you to think of the issues that your organization is working on and try to think up and come up with a video strategy for those, to work on those issues, both production, which we've covered today, obviously, and distribution, which we'll get to next week. So I'd encourage you over the next couple of weeks before we meet again to start thinking about some of those issues that you're working on, how you can incorporate video into all of that, because I will ask you to write that up. And so next steps, this PowerPoint and the recorded webinar that Leandro recorded will be posted on the platform. I'd encourage you all to use the platform both to introduce yourselves, but also share ideas, challenges. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about this brainstorm that I just put at you, what sort of issues you're working on and where you think video might be helpful. Please share examples of videos you've seen. I'll continue to do that, but if there's anything you've seen, feel free to post it to the group. We're gonna start next week by discussing the two videos that I asked you to watch, Wiring the Amazon, which I made, and 10 Hours Walking in New York City as a Woman, which was made on a shoestring budget for a few $100s. I think they're both very different, but good examples of a lot of things we've been talking about today. That webinar will be 2 weeks from today, same time on June 7th. And at that time, I'll also be sharing the personal task with you. Okay? So I believe that is it. And thank you all so much for coming. I hope this was helpful, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation online.